afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of religion, in today's lecture, I am going to discuss a very important thinker, that's Karl Marx. Most of us who have studied sociology are familiar with Karl Marx as he is one of the founding figures in sociology. Today, we are going to discuss Karl Marx's concepts or his understanding on religion. But before we understand what Karl Marx talks about religion, we need to understand who was Karl Marx and specifically his method or approach to study society. And to begin with, we'll see that Karl Marx was a German philosopher and he made an attempt to understand religion from a scientific objective perspective. If we keep in mind the context in which Karl Marx was writing, it was a time when sociology was being designed as a science of society. That is, people were making an attempt to understand society from a scientific perspective. What is known in sociology as positivist school or positivism. So in that perspective, Karl Marx was making an attempt to understand society. And we see that nowhere is he specifically talking about religion. He is known for his theory of class struggle, for the understanding of capitalism, alienation, but he is not specifically addressing religion as such. But then, through his understanding of society, because he's trying to problematize understanding of society, he makes reference to what is religion, and we'll see in the course of the discussion that he's putting religion within the context of class struggle between how people from the class which does not have property, who don't own property, take on religion as a kind of a illusion. For them, it is a means of coming out of the class structure. And therefore, it is very important to first understand Marx's theory of class struggle, Marx's theory of class analysis. And we'll kind of understand that when we look into Karl Marx or we try to understand Karl Marx, what comes into mind is his understanding of materialism. And in that context, he will put religion as an expression of material realities. Now, what does it mean when we talk about materialism? It says something which has a value, something which has an exchange value, and therefore he will be putting an understanding of religion within the broader context of economic determinism, or what we call as materialistic or historical materialism. In literature or text on Karl Marx, we get to hear a lot of terms: dialectical materialism, historical materialism. So these are where in which he is trying to understand the structures of society from an economic perspective. He tries to reduce most of the understanding of what the structure of a society is dependent on the relations of modes of production, and that is materialistic understanding. So when we try to understand religion, he would be actually looking into the problems of society, and problems of society in terms of the inequality, the difference, oppression in terms of exploitation, or also within the larger discourse on the shift of society due to industrialization, urbanization, towards an alienated society, towards a fetish society. So we will put his understanding of religion and keep in mind his larger debates of class struggle and dialectical materialism. So if we kind of quickly look into his theory of class struggle, we know that Karl Marx looked into history as a class struggle. And what was the struggle around? The struggle was around the material production. When he talks about material production, basically he wants to say that there is a means of production, that is through which you can produce or manufacture. And what are the means of production? It could be a land, it could be ownership of factory, it could be the modes of production. So there is a class struggle between those who have ownership of the modes of production versus those who are denied any kind of access. And in this context, he will say that as as society moves, it is an indication of change in the ownership of modes of production. So history is a representation of the struggle over the material production, and history in according to Karl Marx is basically based on material, economic and social conditions. For him, the social condition of individuals in a society at a particular point of history is the outcome of his economic conditions. So if you are, say, in a position to own a property, then your social status in society is better because you have a bargaining power and you can bargain. Whereas those who do not have any access to property, their social status is kind of at the margin because they cannot kind of determine what price should they get for their labor. Marx was looking into, so most of the time referring to the European history, and he says that all developing society kind of passes through this phase, and as the modes of production or the relations of material production changes, there is a social change that kind of takes place. So materialism, according to Karl Marx, and this is in the words of Marx, is the sum total of the natural environment, and this includes all of inorganic nature, the organic world, social life and human consciousness. So he is kind of not making any kind of a distinction between economic, social and your capacity to kind of be conscious about your status in society. So they are kind of related, and the base for him, if we kind of look into his theory, he says the base is the economy, and on the base we can kind of place the culture. So the moment the base changes, it would automatically lead to change in the social and cultural element. So dialectic is a term which he borrowed from Hegel, and dialectical, he is kind of interested in, dialectical means two-way. So it kind of refers to human conditions or history of human life being conditioned by material economic conditions. So just as change is kind of a part of society, if history, when we go to history, it talks about the stages of the development of society. So when we try to understand from a dialectical materialism, then it implies that the material conditions in the society have undergone change, which has resulted a change in the course of the history, and therefore his kind of focus or main motive was to understand human behavior, and by understanding human behavior, he is trying to make reference to history and economy. And in this discourse of trying to understand the evolution of the historical stages from, say, capitalism to communism, he was trying to understand the functions of religion or what role religion plays in different stages of history. So therefore, when we look into his economic theory, for which he is more well read and more recognized, we see that he kind of creates a structure which in most of the textbook would be represented as a triangle. And I just said that the base of the triangle would be the material sources or material conditions, and this would include division of labor, class struggle, and on top of the base, if we move towards the edge of the triangle, is based the social institution. So which kind of is in reflection that whatever change takes place, they will be reflected on the apex, and therefore economic conditions led to change in the social conditions. So institutions which are at the superstructure are built upon the base of economy, totally dependent on material and economic realities. All of these institutions, which is kind of social and cultural, which is a part of everyday life, like marriage, church, government, art, etc., can be understood when we understand the relations to economic forces. And as I've already said, the economic forces is basically the relations to the means of production. And in a very commonsensical word, it refers to the relations between those who have ownership, and this is the capitalist class, versus those who are denied any kind of. And when we look into his theory of class struggle, it refers to the class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. So Marx observed that there is a parallel between religious and socio-economic activity. So for him, it was the change in economic conditions that would bring about a change in the religious conditions. So the role of religion during capitalism would be entirely different from what it would be during communism. In later lectures, we will talk about Weber, and we see how Weber would turn Marx upside down. For Weber, it would be the social cultural dimension or structure that would lead to change in the economic conditions. And for that is classical work of Weber, The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism is the most important work that we refer to in sociology. Opposed to Karl Marx, Weber would suggest that it was the Protestant ethic, that is religion or part of the cultural life, that led to the development of capitalism. So we will discuss more about Weber in the next lecture, but today let's try to understand Marx. So for Marx, any kind of change in the culture is the outcome of the change in the relations to modes of productions. And in that context, Marx saw religion as a social product emerging out of social relations. So, and the relations here is basically it was to do with the ownership of property, but it was also a social relation because it decided the relation between the proletariat and the bourgeois. So, out of this relation between the two classes, religion kind of emerges. Religion did not exist all by itself, independent of social and economic forces. And later on, he looks into from a conflict perspective, and that's what Karl Marx theory is kind of more put into sociology books as conflict theories, is to look into how religion becomes a means to control the mass. The mass are the ones who do not have access to the capitalist modes of production. And it also becomes an instrument in legitimizing injustice. Where is the injustice? The injustice is when we go into Karl Marx economic theory, where the surplus value from any kind of a manufacturing or production is appropriated by the upper class, and therefore those who are at the are not being sufficiently compensated for the labor that they have put into it. So there is an element of inequality or injustice, and religion comes in here as an instrument of justifying or kind of legitimizing that injustice coming out of the class differences. So it was during the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Renaissance and Reformation was a period when there was a kind of lot of discussions or debates, discourse on kind of purifying religion, specifically in the Western context, the Christianity. And this was a time when the church and the state got separated, and there was the idea that church and state had two different kind of domain to function. Prior to that, it was the church which was regulating the political role of the society as well. So during the Reformation or post-Reformation, religion started being questioned. The role of religion started being questioned, and that is where we will see that we can put in Marx theory of understanding religion as an opium of the masses. So when we look into his materialistic perspective, the approach that he takes on to understand religion is from a materialistic perspective. He focused on the political aspect of religion and use or abuse as a means of moral and intellectual repression. So it's kind of when he's kind of will say that it is something which the working class kind of take recourse to, it kind of gives them a belief or a feeling that what is happening to them in terms of not being given the required wage or value is something which is justified or something which is okay, and then you can kind of pray or you can worship and kind of think of improving the conditions. According to Marx, the discussion of labor in capitalist society the development of the structure of market and the consequent exploitation of labor by subjugating humans to the product of their own labor led to the condition of alienation of human. So, when we go into his work of capitalism and labor theory, we will see he was basically trying to understand the problems that was emerging because of this change of society. And where was the change taking place? The change was by and large taking place in the economic domain. It was a shift from a kind of a society where there was kind of collective sharing, there was subsistence economy, there was no kind of concept of the factory, there was no concept of market. It was production and consumption was happening within the family, and it was a family labor which was involved. As soon as factories were set up and markets came in, which was kind of the beginning of the capitalist economy, therefore there was a kind of a relation between those who had ownership of these and the others who were putting in their labor, and those who were laboring or the working class were denied the true value of the labor that they were doing. And when we go into detail, we see he talks about alienation, and alienation from your own product, alienation from your own community, and alienation from the process of production, which kind of ultimately alienates the working class from the society as such. Humans who were unable to regulate their own world turned to religion. So, since they could not do much within the work area, that is the factory, where they had no say in the what kind of product was being produced, what was the process of production, they had kind of very limited relations between their co-workers. So, therefore, these workers who were denied any kind of interaction or any kind of position in the factory turned to religion, and that is where he's looking into religion as a product of class struggle. So, alienating working class, those who were kind of not figuring out what economic process was for them, turned to religion. And this was kind of precisely shifted focus from a more materialistic, pragmatic critique of religion. Religion serves to mystify the real relation between men and inanimate object. According to Marx, nature is impersonal force which imposes limitations on man's capacity to act. But nature can be understood scientifically and manipulated rationally via technology, and which kind of gives more potential for the benefit of mankind. So, it is kind of, he says that when there was everybody had equal say, it was all kind of natural production and there was no technology, then the relations between human beings were more or less egalitarian. There was a kind of more in terms of collective living. As soon as technology comes in, it starts manipulating human relations or the relations between man and men, and inequality kinds of creeps in. Through religion, human projects personal characteristics onto nature. So, therefore, when the technology is kind of creating an unequal, unjust relation between individuals, then the people would take recourse to nature, and nature in the sense here would be kind of relying more on supernatural forces in terms of trying to invent God or trying to think about a superpower or say a deity or any powerful person who could bring about a change in this situation. So, that is why he is kind of critiquing, he is giving us a critique of religion, and there he says that, see, there is a kind of a relation between the capitalist and non-capitalist, and these the working class or those who do not have any kind of ownership are unable to bring about control their situation. So, what ultimately comes is that they start believing in someone who would have control over the and bring about a change in this, and that is why they start kind of believing and manipulating nature to appeal gods and deities through rituals and sacrifices. For Marx, religion is one of those institutions which are dependent upon the material and economic realities in a given society. Why dependent on the given society? Because until and unless such a relations of inequality and appropriation, alienation did not take place, religion would have no space. So only when capitalism or economic exploitation, alienation started happening, that people took recourse to religion. They started kind of believing that there would be some hope that things would there would be some change. So it has no independent history, instead the creature of productive forces. Marx wrote in one of his work that the religion world is but the reflex of the real world. What does it mean here? That what is taking place in terms of the material reality. So if there was equality, if there was a collective production and everybody had an equal share, if there was no appropriation of surplus value, then religion as such would have not kind of existed or would have not been able to kind of become prominent. But it kind of, when we see that there is an institution called religion on which a population is dependent, it implies that there is some problem in that society, and therefore religion is reflecting the problem that the society is undergoing. According to Marx, religion can only be understood in relation to other social system and the economic structure of society. And this is why his theory is kind of considered as a materialistic perspective on religion. The most common statement, or we can say a popular statement that most of the students of sociology have heard it in their school or college day, is the phrase religion as the opium of the people. This is a statement that Marx wrote in one of his work, and to state it directly from his work, he writes, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. What does it imply? Like, it is kind of an addiction. It is kind of an, like when we kind of are under certain kind of drug, we kind of tend to be away from the reality. We go into a different illusionary world, which is different from the reality. So he's comparing it. He's saying that when we take recourse to religion, it helps us kind of reduce the suffering or the feeling of the suffering of oppression, of appropriation, and kind of people are then feeling more comfortable. So, but keep in mind that he's not calling it as a disease. Religion is not the disease. It is just a symptom of any kind of ailment in the society. So it is and what is the symptom that he is hinting at? The symptom is inequality. The symptom is the relation between those who have extra and excess and appropriate, and the others who are denied the basic conditions of life. So that is this symptoms of oppression, the symptom that some people are being appropriated, they are being oppressed, and religion helps them to feel better, helps them to come out of the distress and kind of not experience all the kind of ailment that is part of the society. And therefore we say religion is illusion. Religion for God as a human creation and not the other way around. It is deities, God, superpower, whatever term we use, it's something which has been created by society themselves in order to come out of a situation which is kind of alienating and misery, full of misery. So religion and the capitalist mode of productions both were the cause of man's alienation. So once you kind of get addicted to this kind of a feeling, you get again alienated from the society and you start kind of living into a different world. That is why he's saying that religion and capitalism both leads to alienation. So other dominant ideology, the idea of ruling class, is the bourgeois. Capitalism, on the other hand, protected human-like values to the product of human labor and alienating man's labor. But then he will be kind of, if we go into in terms of summarizing what Marx was saying, he was saying that the function of religion is to prevent people making demands for social change by dulling pain of oppression. So once you are not even about, you are not going to become conscious about it, you are not going to feel the appropriation, or you're not going to feel the brunt of the inequality, then you're not going to take any conscious effect. So that is a negative kind of a thing, that you will kind of maintain status quo. It will not lead to change. So if you were to bring about a change, then you have to kind of become conscious, what Marx calls as class conscious. And only when class consciousness would be there would be a kind of a struggle between the ruling class and the ruled, and therefore it would kind of bring about an end of the class. So religion strips humans of qualities, assigns them to supernatural being and other kind of, so it can be said that religion, according to Karl Marx, was a means to justify social order and people's position. It can be said, there's a lot of critique who would say that religion was then kind of supporting the growth of capitalism, and the objective truth that proletariat would suffer deprivation and because of exploitation. So this is how we'll put into Marx's theory of religion a materialistic perspective of religion, in order to understand the problems of society when capitalism was an economic order. So that is the theory of Karl Marx, and with this I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.